The 30,000 foot view, I think most good herd health veterinarians are pretty good at this. We ask what's going on, what are the inputs in this operation. I read that I think it's good to think horizontally. What's going on the edges of this issue? We all know about corn picker's disease or haymaker's disease. It happens during the harvest season, and there's always more problems with the animals during that time of year because the systems manager is distracted with other things. Also, the 30,000 foot view, we might have to, we'll think about our boundaries there. How big of a problem are we going to attack today? One veterinary example I remember is a fellow in practice who always had these strange cow diseases. He seemed to be a good cowman, but he had some funny problems in this dairy herd. Fortunately or unfortunately, he and his partner broke up, and he did what was rare to do in the 80s, is he just set up a strict milking system. He bought all these feedstuffs, and he did great. He did great with the cows. Well, it turned out he just didn't know how to grow feed. So once he solved that particular input problem, he was on his way. Dr. Alex Ramirez here at Iowa State teaches the students about the 4 circles approach to pig health. First off, do a complete walk around the outside of the building. Maybe we should even walk to the edge of the property. Do a complete walk around the inside of the building. Then a complete evaluation around the individual pen before you get to the individual animal. How many of us as veterinarians are honed in on that individual sick animal? The next systems thinking skill is systems as a cause, where we ask, what are the structural relationships? I like to think about, would we have this same or very similar problem if we had a different infectious agent involved? Some systems examples that I can think of, and I challenge you all to think of some others and add them to the website, are things like, well, we're not weaning enough pigs, or we have a poor conception rate for the beef cows, or neonatal scours, or the prevalence of salmonella at slaughter is 5 times higher than at the farm. Maybe you're not weaning enough pigs because you're not breeding enough sows. Maybe you have a poor conception rate for cows because you don't have enough bulls. Some simple systemic things like that. A good example, I think, of the systems is what they call the Stanford University prison experiment, where they had these students role play. Some were prison guards, some were prisoners, and it was very quick that those in the prison guard role quickly took on abusive, domineering kind of behavior just because they were given that role. Another way to think about it is how these stocks and flows are connected, and we'll talk a little bit more about what are stocks and flows. Here's an example, I think, of systems as a cause. In earlier studies, it was reported that the salmonella on farms are fairly low. The salmonella prevalence once pigs get to the slaughterhouse is much higher, and most everybody said, well, it's because of the stress of transport. Well, we took that system and broke it up into a few more processes, where we look at the transportation process, and then one that hadn't been talked about a lot, which is the lairage process. As you can see in this figure, on the truck and on the farm, only about 5% of the pigs had salmonella, but once they got through lairage and after lairage, about 40% of them had salmonella. So we found that the lairage was one of the biggest risk factors in this system. Operational thinking. How is this thing supposed to work? Function is the key, not the parts, not the elements. It's really inherent to veterinary medicine when we think about the individual animal. Yet we still boil it down, unfortunately, to a differential diagnosis list. We understand operational thinking when we think, for example, about the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. If they don't function, if they don't keep in balance, if they don't feed back to each other, things just don't work well. Operational thinking, we want to think about cause and effect relationships. And we think about what's the system supposed to do. So if we talk about the breeding system, what's it supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to make lactating cows. Why? For the babies or so we can sell the milk? Is the breeding system supposed to give us some specialized purebred genetic animals, or is it supposed to give us hybrid animals to be raised for meat? Thinking about those important operational questions help us in our diagnosis and treatment. So now we pause for a minute to think about how to represent a system. And there's some building blocks, some schematics shown in this figure. As you can see here, we've got open females going through the breeding process, becoming pregnant females. Those pregnant females then go through the birthing process, and if we're talking dairy cows, it's also called the freshening process. And we get two outputs. We get the offspring, and we get a lactating female. So you'll see in that figure a few elements that we'll talk about a lot. Stocks or state variables, and they contain a quantity of units, the number of open animals, the number of pregnant animals. And then there's flows or processes. And in my previous, no, skip that. Flows or processes which represent a change or a movement from one state to another. There also are going to be what comes out of a process is an output. What goes in is the input. And then we have converters, which are those little circles. You might think of them as coefficients as you would in a regression equation. And those are the multiple factors that help describe how this flow goes. And then overtly or not is the boundary. I mean, there's the edge of a paper, there's the edge of the problem, there's the edge of a farm, there's the edge of how much we can do on this particular problem today. Just to emphasize, operational thinking to me is all about change. It's all about transformation. So when you go into a problem, ask yourself, what are the changes? What's supposed to be happening? So if we're talking infectious diseases, we have susceptible animals changing to infectious. Infected, change to immune. Sick, change to dead. If we talk about a finishing barn, then we're converting feed to body weight. In the packing plant, we're converting live animals to carcasses, carcasses to meat, meat to human illness with foodborne pathogens potentially. If we're looking at the foodborne illness system or factory, or that we convert open animals to pregnant, milking to dry, unvaccinated to vaccinated, and so forth. So operational is about change. Closed loop thinking, the next one. We ask, can this set of reciprocal relationships, so we have these connected, that I piece together, in fact, generate the behavior that is being produced? Or what factors drive or impact the input and output relationships? Closed loop thinking, if we look at our breeding example, say if we ask about the converter called conception rate, and if we're talking about natural breeding in the field, then the male to female ratio might be an important reciprocal relationship. So as that ratio changes, as the number of open females decreases, assuming you have enough bulls to get them bred in the first place, then the male to female ratio goes up, you have a few more males, and this breeding process over time might speed up a little bit. You might also look at how season's going to change this relationship if you have seasonal breeding. So we're asking about how these factors feedback, interact, and change the behavior of the system. Some behaviors in a closed-loop system you're probably familiar with is the exponential growth curve. For example, you put bacteria in fresh media, they have a nice exponential growth curve until, what? They run out of resources or it gets too crowded. Same thing with an uncontrolled epidemic. It's usually an exponential growth curve until we run out of susceptibles. Extinction of a species may go on until it actually goes beyond a certain threshold. Here's an example from a Stella model. The blue line shows natural resources. As they goes down, the population of critters consuming those natural resources goes up until it reaches a point and the relationships change. It's clearly not linear anymore, and you may go all the way to the total collapse or total extinction of this population.